not necessarily about China, Australia, but what to do with the disputes in the South China Sea. We heard Professor Wang briefly from the backgrounder, the comments coming from Chinese Foreign Minister, and also earlier from the Defense Minister, Secretary rather, of the United States. Diplomacy priority. Do you think that can be done? Professor Wang, briefly.
I think the South China Sea is moving to the right direction. Whether the U.S. make it quite a positive appeal, I think, but also we improve relations with the Philippines and Vietnam, and with the RCEP negotiation, I think Australia, should work on that kind of the transition.
Okay, is that going to be welcomed by Australia? After all, Mr. Wilson, we understand there are American Marines starting 2 years ago rotating in the northern port city of Darwin in Australia as a result of pivot to Asia from the United States. Is Australia going to adopt what kind of approach?
Australia's going to maintain a position it's had for a long time on this, which is firstly the country is not a party to any of the disputes in the region and simply seeks a negotiated diplomatic and rules-based solution to these issues. The presence of US Marines in Darwin is not a big issue when you consider Australia has military cooperation agreements with many different defence forces through the region, including exercises with China on occasion. So this doesn't change Australia's diplomacy on this issue.
Mr. Wilson, we understand the new Secretary of State of the United States, Mr. Tillerson, recently has called the Australian side. Well, there are several phone calls, 3 phone calls. First of all, by the American president, which did not last for 1 hour, but only 25 minutes. We all know the drama over there. Secondly, by Mr. McCain, a leading senator from the U.S., tried to affirm, Australia, you are having great relations still. And thirdly, coming from the Secretary of State, the newly confirmed by the Senate, by the American Congress, that it is working, the alliance. What do you make of these series of calls from U.S. and your judgment about Australia's nature of ties with the U.S. at this point?
Developments in the US, particularly with Donald Trump, are very concerning to many Australians. As you've mapped out just now, we have a situation where many parts of the new Trump administration are saying one thing, but some of the messages we're hearing from Donald Trump are very much the other, and particularly a big concern for Australia is Donald Trump's message on trade to the region. Pulling out of the TPP, refusing to participate in a number of trade agreements unless they turn a surplus for the US, and threatening in some cases trade war against China. These would be disastrous outcomes for the region, for China and for Australia. And so it's very disconcerting to hear these kind of messages coming out, and it's difficult for subsequent phone calls to compensate when we've heard so much of this from Trump for so many months now.
But Mr. Wilson, there has been a mixture of signals. First of all, there is history. I mean, Australia is a loyal ally of the United States. That's been there for more than 25 years. But at the same time, according, for example, the Essential report, 15% of Australians would vote for Donald Trump only if they had to vote in the U.S. presidential election. Of course, that's an interesting question to be posed to the voters. 71% would vote for Hillary Clinton. People have their preferences, but Mr. Trump already become the United States president. So the phone call has become such a big issue between the president of U.S. and the prime minister of Australia. But having said that, there is this 75-year strong allied relations. So how would Australia weigh the short-term administration, 4 years, their policies, vis-a-vis Australia's overall strategic interest in the region, particularly with 75-year-old ally already?
I think an important thing to remember here is that Australia's military alliance with the US, which is called the ANZUS Treaty, is a security arrangement, not a broader diplomatic agreement to be aligned on absolutely everything. Australia doesn't need American permission and indeed doesn't ask for it to do many things in the region. Sign a trade agreement with China, be a participant in the RCEP negotiations, or indeed, if you go back just over a year ago, join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank at a time when the United States was telling many countries not to do so. Australia was one of the first that came in and is a founding member of the AIIB. So these decisions are somewhat worrying in terms of the US's reliability under the Trump administration as a security partner, but they don't hold Australia back in doing any of the other kind of regional initiatives that we're talking about here. And hopefully some of our emphasis can be pressed more into those areas moving forwards.
The so-called Muslim ban, of course, was very much a big issue between the two countries when it comes to what kind of ideology, what kind of belief a country like a democracy should have. Mr. Wilson.
Well, I think from what your viewers have just seen from that speech, which I heard as well, was inconsistent, incoherent, and it made no sense. This is not, he has contradicted himself, said this is a Muslim ban when it's not really explained why it targets the 7 countries it does and not some others. This kind of leadership and self-aggrandisement really makes a lot of countries, and certainly by no means just Australia, very concerned about what the leadership in the United States is going to do in the future.
Well, that is, of course, one of those stories going on right now, but we still want to come back to another great story, which is the interaction between China and Australia. That's why we have you, Professor Wang, together with your Australian counterpart. Let me ask you about this. Mr. Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, said very clearly in his remarks delivering in Australia, he said, sober-minded politician, both in China and Australia, and the United States understand conflicts between China and the United States is going to make both sides lose. That's an exact quote coming from the Chinese foreign minister. And therefore, how is China going to work its relation with Australia, which of course traditionally is an ally of the United States, but certainly having certain kinds of disputes, at least verbally recently? Professor Wang.
Well, Australia is a very good example between East and West, and between Asia and with the Pacific. I think we started the FTA with China, improve our relations. But now I think from the video, I also very glad to hear that the Foreign Minister of Australia said that Australia can be the reliable partner for China. That means that even the United States airlines that can have good relations both with China and the United States, and even security cooperation also is moving on. So I think that's very important to redefine the airline system of the United States that make it more inclusive to China, and this is very important.
The Foreign Secretary of Australia, Ms. Julie Bishop, Mr. Wilson, has been talking about greater cooperation, tourism, regional infrastructure, innovation, energy, and both sides, she said, has been elevating the level of priority of its trade and economic ties between China and Australia. How is Australia going to balance your relation with China and the United States? One is a longtime ally, the other is an extremely important partner in the region, and certainly a rising power beyond even the region.
One way is that countries like Australia can do this, and it's certainly not only Australia that faces these decisions to make after Donald Trump's election, is to try and focus, at least initially and immediately while we work out what's happening, on some of the areas we can immediately make gains and make improvements and strengthen both bilateral and regional architectures. And if you look at Australia and China, there is a density of bilateral connections, particularly in the mining sector, to do with education, to do with even population movements. 1.7% of the Australian population was born in mainland China. But there is much less connecting our countries in terms of a regional architecture. And this is where initiatives like AIIB, as it steps up operations this year, or the last year of negotiations for the RCEP trade agreement are going to provide an opportunity to not just do these things bilaterally, but on a regional basis and bring in a number of other countries as well.
Of course, those are also important issues for China. also Belt and Road Initiative, which China put forward, but certainly can be enjoyed, the benefits by all the countries along it. Professor Wang, this is about how to have win-win and how to have balanced proportion of the win-win for all the partners. China, Australia, 1 year ago signed this free trade agreement. Bilateral, very important. Now you also hear the US President, Mr. Trump, talking about we want to do bilateral and bilateral only. That seems to be his rhetoric. So what do you think, how the two countries, China, Australia, will be able to put in more content into this bilateral free trade agreement and really move just beyond the original thought of just trade and economy?
Well, China, Australia's FTA take a leading role to improve the relations of China with other developing nations. And going beyond that, because of there are many uncertainties, trade war, currency war is happening, that China, Australia cooperate to put forward the free trade and globalization. I think it's been very meaningful. Put forward also the RCEP negotiation. Australia is also the natural extension of the maritime Silk Road of the South Pacific. So Australia also take a leading role in the South Pacific cooperations with China, which not just focus on trade, but also focus on the climate change and the maritime security and resources under the sea, and also protection, so environmental protection, medicine, others. So I think we hope that Australia can improve our relations with 45 years of diplomatic relations to build in the 21st century Maritime Silk Road.
Mr. Wilson, at this point, many have argued what really are going to bring countries together at this stage of our world. Is it only about political systems or trade and economic ties? Or there's a much bigger so-called international ideology, which is something called globalization. Obviously, Australia has to be committed to globalization. You're a country with almost no neighbors immediately adjacent to you, right? New Zealand. But, and therefore, globalization, regionalization is key to your life. So is there something of a much bigger self, globalization, of a much bigger world that would bring the two countries to a much bigger goal, Mr. Wilson?
I think that's absolutely right, and as you point out, Australia is a very small country that's very
not
geographically
a small country
isolated.
at all. It's a
For
beautiful
most of
country.
Australia's history, going back geographically large, but population-wise very small. You could fit Australia into several Chinese provinces.
Wow.
But going back, Australia's entire history has been built on migration and exports and person-to-person connections. Unfortunately, globalisation for the whole globe has proven hard. If you look at trade, the WTO has been stuck in a deadlock. If you look at other institutions like the United Nations Security Council or something like that, there has been a lot of problems at the global level. But what we might be able to do is things in the regional level. If you look at the Asia-Pacific region, broadly constructed to capture Australia, New Zealand and even India at its western edge, this is a part of the world that has almost half the world's population, half the world's production, and is the most dynamic, fast-growing and innovative part of the world. And if globalisation might not work, then regionalisation is something that possibly like-minded countries could come and do together more easily.
Professor Wang, what is your thought? Chinese President Xi Jinping at the latest Davos World Economic Forum talking about China certainly support the great side of globalization.
Yes, you cannot blame globalization because of the side effect of the globalization, but we need to reform, make it more balanced, inclusive, and sustainable. I think that China, Australia in this regard can cooperate more, including the green Silk Road, healthy Silk Road, and peaceful Silk Road, and smart Silk Road, we say.